Well, here we are again with the unedited, uncut video version of the 1002 Bible Reading Plan with Pastor Troy. And this week, we're reading the book of Exodus. What a great book. If you've never read that, I would encourage you to read it. It actually moves along really well. And the whole idea of the Exodus is when God delivers his people from Egypt. We saw in Genesis how they got there through Joseph and Jacob's family, and now a whole nother leader is going to raise up in Moses, and God is going to call them out of Egypt, back to the promised land. But we get to chapter 4, and you actually see the kind of person that God uses. Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter in the courts of Pharaoh, but he knew that he was a Jew, and he was actually nursed by his own mother, and so he kept that affinity for them. And so when they were being beaten as slaves, he actually defended one of the Jews who'd been beaten and took the life of an Egyptian. But then the next day, when he saw two Jews actually fighting with one another, he tried to break up the fight, and one of them said, "Are you going to kill me too?" And so then he thought, "Oh no, I thought nobody saw what I did, and now I'm exposed." And so he fled out of Egypt, and God just kept his hand on him, and he became a shepherd in the wilderness, literally, for 40 years. And so now he's a shepherd, and in this wilderness, God appears to him, we know the story, in a burning bush, and calls him to be the deliverer of his people out of Egypt. And Moses begins to make all kinds of excuses, and he says, "I am not your guy." And God said, "No, actually, you are my guy." And one of the ways that I love to talk about this story is a real change of identity that we can see in chapter 4 about Moses and how even he saw himself. So I'm going to read some of these verses, and then I'm going to talk about an idea with you real briefly. So God is talking to Moses, and Moses says to God in chapter 4, "Well, what if they don't believe me and will not obey me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you,'" because that's how he felt. And the Lord asked him, "What is that in your hand?" And so Moses said to God, "Well, it's my staff." And God said, "Throw it down." And so Moses threw it to the ground, and it became a snake. And Moses did what every logical person would do. He ran from it. And the Lord told Moses, "Stretch out your hand and grab it by the tail." So Moses stretched out his hand, and he grabbed it by the tail, and it became a rod again. But the interesting thing about that moment in Moses' life, that by the time we get to verse 20, and God is actually getting Moses to go to Egypt, in verse 20 it says, "And Moses took God's staff in his hand." So God said at the beginning of his ministry, "What is that in your hand?" And he said, "Well, it's my staff. It's the symbol of me being a shepherd. It's my walking stick. It's what I would use to defend against predators that would come into the sheep." And God said to Moses, "I need you to put that down." But it wasn't because God wanted him to totally abandon all that training that he had. It's just that God wanted him to redefine actually the tool of his trade from his staff to God's staff. And you're going to see as you read in Exodus that Moses is going to use that staff in so many ways. And it became for him a symbol of God's authority in his life and over his life, and a symbol of God's authority over the lives of God's people. So let's apply this to us. What is it that identifies you? In other words, what is in your hands? Are you using that for God's good and for his glory? I think God would want you to throw that down, but not to throw it away, but actually to pick it up again and for it to lose its identity as yours, but actually to begin its identity as God's. Because God is calling us to invest our life in a way that matters forever. And he's gifted us, and he's blessed us, and he's given us a stewardship. And my prayer for all of us is that we would take what God has given us, that we would lay it at the feet of the cross, and then when we pick it up again, we wouldn't see it as ours, but we would see it as God's to use. Just a little story from the book of Exodus, an example of Moses' life, and I pray that as you get through this book that you'll see how Moses lost his identity in God, but he picked it up again as he sought to be obedient to what God had for his life. See you next week.